really dig through and try to understand what the consequence is. Wind generation is variable, and it can be hard to predict depending on what you're trying to predict. Okay, we can't get around that. We have to understand it. It used to be very expensive, okay, but now it's not. I think if you did an analysis of the cap and trade legislation, okay, and looked at what that would do to the cost of electricity from a coal plant, okay, there are winds in the Midwest, high enough annual capacity factor, where that energy would probably be cheaper for wind. Okay, so that's kind of where we're headed, or could be headed. A lot of the misunderstanding can be traced to not knowing exactly how the electric power system works. Okay, so this has to be backed up, you know, kind of stuff comes from there. The nature of wind generation too, you have to look very carefully at what's going on here in terms of the variability and the uncertainty before you can jump to conclusions. And then we've learned a lot over the last 20 years, the last 10 years. You know, we have plants in the ground that we're able to measure and look at and see what they do. And so with that as a backdrop, you know, some of these things maybe aren't as scary as they first seem. So cost of wind energy, you know, basically what happened, unfortunately, we were on this curve, 2000, 2005, and then because of the uncertainty with production tax credit, the industry hadn't scaled up, turbines actually started to get more expensive. So the cost of wind energy actually started to go up a little bit. Long-term, consistent policy, larger industry, we hope to be able to keep the cost flat, maybe even reduce it some. So the other one that's important here is that this is back in 2003. Public Service Colorado had an all-source solicitation for third-party generation. And they got wind and gas bids. And there's good winds in Colorado. So the wind bids were cheaper than the gas bids because the gas folks said, well, we're not thinking $2 anymore, it's going to go up. So we have to, we're going to bid a little bit more. So wind won on an apples-to-apples kind of basis. That was back in 2003. Who knows what gas prices are going to do going forward, but it certainly could be there again. The other issue that makes, or the other attribute that makes wind energy attractive relative to, say, natural gas, is that I build a wind plant, and I'm pretty sure over 20 years, 25-year project lifetime, what energy I'm going to get. And if I sign a power purchase agreement, okay, I have defined over 20 years how much that energy is going to cost me. If I have a gas plant, I can't come close to that because I don't know what fuel prices are going to do. So in a portfolio sense, if I look at wind versus gas, there's a hedge value of wind that can be quantified, and it's significant. It can be several dollars per megawatt hour, maybe $5, $6, $7 per megawatt hour of wind, just in terms of the portfolio risk. So what about it goes from 0 to 100% and back, and I can't manage it because of the variability and the uncertainty, and I have to back it up 1 for 1 because it doesn't blow. We'll forget about the frequency control for tonight. And then the forecasting is important, and you know, the first glance, first experience for a lot of folks who've been these are just terrible. I'm not going to use them at all, kind of thing. So let's talk about those. Variability and uncertainty. Yes, wind generation is variable and uncertain, but so is the world. Okay? In electric power systems, we've been dealing with variability and uncertainty on all time scales since we started doing this. Okay? So it's the incremental variability and uncertainty from wind generation that's really important here that we have to understand, because load varies all time frames. I have to forecast load for a lot of things. For tomorrow, I have to forecast load for 10 years from now, so I have enough capacity to serve that load. Huge uncertainty there, huge consequences in terms of forecast error, if you will. My conventional supply resources aren't perfectly reliable. I might say tomorrow I'm going to run these plants to serve this forecast load, but tomorrow one of those plants isn't there. I have to deal with all those things. I have to deliver the reliability in the face of this variability and uncertainty, and we've been doing a really good job of it for a long time. So wind isn't different in that regard. It's a subtlety, and I need to understand what the impact is on the margins. This is actual data. This is actual utility load. The magenta line is is the load itself. The blue line on the top graph is that load minus the wind generation. Again, they have a couple hundred megawatts, right? Well, let's zoom in a little bit though. On the bottom chart, the magenta line, or the red line, is the aggregate output of 220 megawatt nameplate of wind generation over the course of a day. Okay, and this data is like 4 second by 4 second. The blue line is one of their loads. It's an arc furnace. Okay, so if you look at the same size objects, 200 megawatt wind plant, 150 megawatt or so mill load, you can see the variability they've been dealing with already, and they've been doing a good job of it. The variability of wind and the uncertainty is different though, and they don't have experience with it. With that arc furnace load, they know that if it's up at 150, it's only going to go one direction. Okay, and they build that into what they do when they're operating the system. With the wind, they're not sure what it's going to do. And so that confounds them right now, and that's because they don't have experience with it. We'll get there. In terms of the variability of wind generation, if I look at the output of one turbine, okay, at a high enough time resolution, it's pretty ugly. It varies all over the place. But if I look at the output of 10 turbines that are in slightly different locations, what I see is it starts to smooth out a little bit. Then if I look at the output of those 10 turbines with another 10 turbines in the next county, okay, it gets even smoother. That geographic diversity is critical with regard to managing this variability. What we have here, these are from plants in Minnesota and Iowa. And the red plant is from, I guess it's Lake Benton, southwestern Minnesota. The blue line is from Storm Lake, which is about 150 miles straight south of Lake Benton, thereabouts, maybe a little east. And what you see here is both plants at the beginning of the chart down to zero, no wind. Okay, then a front comes through, and they both end up raging. Well, what happens though? The Lake Benton plant comes up first, okay, because of where it's physically located. Then the Storm Lake plant. So in terms of going from nothing to something, it's not both of those plants at the same time that the power system operator has to worry about. In this instance, that front took a while to progress. So there's a smoother sort of change from very low output to very high output. That's critical with regard to the variability, that geographic smoothing. The farther I go, the better it gets. These are some examples. This is from the Dakotas. I think it's South Dakota. There's a 100-mile line, and there's different areas. When we look at it, a long-term record, these are weeks, I guess we're showing. There are some weeks where all the plants kind of behave the same. Okay, they might blow at night during the day, and so the aggregate kind of looks like a replica of the individual plants. But then there's a lot of times where they're not correlated. Okay, so there's a significant smoothing that I get. In terms of how that impacts, in this case, the WAPA Upper Great Plains folks in Watertown, understanding that is very, very important. Okay, and it also shows that I can't take one plant and just multiply that by 10 if I'm going to get 10 times as much wind and say, well, that's what I'll have to deal with, because that's not the way it's going to work out. We're learning these things sort of on the fly. A couple more questions. So one-for-one backup. Wind generation is unreliable, and the extension of that is it doesn't have any capacity value. A quick little tutorial here. In the electric power systems world, we're worried about capacity because of what someone said before, where 10 years from now, if I turn on my light, I expect the utility to be able to serve that load. Okay? We have to serve that last kilowatt that somebody might want. Okay, so that's not energy, that's not fuel, that's how many megawatts of generation capacity I have. That's how we tend to think in the utility world about designing systems, because of the focus on reliability. Energy is important. I have to be able to get enough fuel and all that kind of stuff, but it's primarily capacity. Wind is an energy resource, okay? It's not a capacity resource. So that's one of the ill fits that we have to deal with, because it's a different kind of stuff. And that's what I just said. Wind energy doesn't fit the model well, the fuel supply is not controllable, and I can't really dispatch it. I have to take what's there, okay, when it's there. And I still have to serve all the load all the other times that